Hello, everyone, and welcome to an interview that I'm doing. No video this day because we weren't able to figure it out. But my name is Travis Gafford. If you are not familiar with my work, I mostly interview in the League of Legends space, mostly around esports, but general esports audience and stuff. That's kind of my audience. But I'm joined right now by Morgan Roman. Did I get it right?
Romine.
Romine. So close. We just talked about that before the start of this. Morgan, maybe it's best if you help introduce yourself and provide some context for your background.
Sure. So I have been in gaming for a long time and in esports for since before it was even called esports. I started off with Ubisoft back in the day, helped found the all women's professional gaming team, the Frag Dolls, went on to be an esports director for an independent studio based out of Orange County, and then through that worked with a bunch of other people in the esports side of things like ESL, and then got my PhD in cultural anthropology, where I was actually studying like local game development culture. And all of that has sort of culminated in my current role as the director of initiatives for AnyKey, which is an advocacy group in gaming where we advocate for diversity and inclusion in esports.
Very good. Well, I want to thank you for sitting down with me or for having this call. I know we were trying to figure out interviews and stuff, and generally speaking, for my audience, I know there's been a lot of people who've been asking me to chime in on the conversation around all the stuff that has come out from Riot Games in the past month or so. And I wanted to figure out a way to be very thoughtful about it, a good approach, and not just be me sort of talking about it. So I think, Morgan, I would say that you qualify as an expert in this field, given all your experience, both, from a pragmatics point of view, but also academically. So super happy to
Mm-hmm.
talk to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to be here. And as you know, like as a PhD and educator, I like to try to help illuminate things that can be murky. And social media these days make things really
Yeah.
murky. So hopefully our conversation can help to help with that.
Yeah, and hopefully this is unique because there are a lot of social media posts about this topic, and so
Yes, there are.
hopefully more than 280 characters will assist. So before we get into it, the one thing I do want to address is that I go into my YouTube demographics, and 95% of the people who watch my videos tend to be male. What I think there's probably a lot of people that are listening to this right now, and they're saying like, "Oh, I'm gonna listen to a woman talk about all this stuff. She's gonna come out and say all this stuff that like I don't want to hear or I'm frustrated with." What would you say to anybody who's like interested in turning this off or maybe not listening to it at all?
Well, if you love Riot and you've been paying attention so far, then you may be pretty frustrated with the dialogue and how it sort of progressed. So I think this is an opportunity to maybe clarify some of the points where like some people are just yelling at each other and not really finding middle ground. I think it's important when you love something and you care about it a lot and you're invested in it to understand why, like, hey, Riot's probably going to be making some changes. Why are they doing that? So even if you ultimately don't agree with the decisions or you don't really think it's important or whatever, to have some background on the changes that they're making might make it seem less frustrating in the future.
Cool. All right. Well, maybe we can just start off with the Kotaku piece that came out that sort of started this conversation a while back. Obviously, there's a ton of stuff that's in there. I think if anybody hasn't read it yet, they should. It certainly has a lot of value to, it provides a lot of context for what this conversation is. But I'd love to get your take. Whenever you saw that article came out, and you read through it, what was your response and kind of thoughts on all this stuff?
So my initial reaction was the opposite of surprise, because this is really what the patterns that they describe and the practices are pretty common, honestly. I mean, it happens to be Riot, who's sort of on deck to face the reality of these practices that they've sort of baked into their culture first. But there are plenty of other studios that do very similar things, so that was not surprising to me. I mean, I've worked in environments where I have seen and been subject to very similar practices, and like I also know a lot of women in the game industry who will tell stories like this like it's just a natural part of the job, which for many of us it kind of is, which is sad, but also the fact that we're able to sort of we have journalists who are bringing this stuff to the surface helps us to admit like, oh yeah, that really actually does suck and seriously impacts my work experience. So I wasn't surprised to summarize it.
Yeah. Since then, there's been several other pieces that have come out, statements from former rioters, current rioters, sort of describing their experiences at the company. You know, one of the things that struck me was that the article described a lot of behavior that was picked up in very different ways by the audience. So, like there's a story about somebody who would go into meetings if there weren't women there, and they'd just like fart in front of somebody, and that became almost like a meme in the community.
Farting on somebody specifically.
Yes, farting on somebody specifically, and that's become a meme in the community. Mm-hmm. But then there are also stories where, like I think it leads with somebody who wanted to hire a female member to their team. And a lot of people sort of frustrated by the idea that they would specifically target a woman to add to the team, rather than looking for somebody who in their mind would just, a better approach would just be to say, hey, we want to hire whoever is best qualified. If it's a woman, that's great. And then even stories that are more specific, just about how very like personal stories about the interactions between a female member of Riot and a male member. So there's a lot of like different types of conversation that are going on in that article. I don't know if you want to, share your thoughts on any of those different types, or kind of the reaction that you've seen from the community on that, or how this stuff unfolds across so many different ways.
Sure. I mean, well, okay. I mean, that's pretty general prompt there, but
yeah.
I think there's a lot to dig into, and maybe just to kind of set the ground rules maybe from the beginning, because I'm making certain assumptions that I want the listeners to know that I'm making certain assumptions. And one of them is that diversity is a good thing. Because if we don't agree that diversity is a good thing, then we're not going to get very far in this discussion anyway. But diversity has been shown, there have been many studies that have shown that in creative environments, diversity is a helpful thing for having a wealth of ideas and perspectives to pull from. It's also advantageous when you have teams that are working on solving problems. When you have diversity, you have a greater array of potential solutions that come to the fore. And so actually actively looking for diverse perspectives is a beneficial thing in a work environment, and certainly in a game development environment. So that's like the first assumption I would say that we're going to work from. The next thing is that one of the sort of underlying issues that will come up a lot when we're talking about game development culture and some of the practices we see in Riot, especially pertaining to how people are promoted and hired and like rewarded within the company, is this idea of meritocracy. And the idea that like, well, if you're better, then you will rise to the top and you will succeed. But when you start to actually unpack what that looks like, there's just a ton of subjective opinions that are informing what people think of as successful, or somebody who's doing a good job is dependent on a lot of subjective judgments. And also dependent on things like your communication style. So at Riot, they really encourage you to be very vocal and very sort of aggressive with your ideas, and they feel like if your idea is worthwhile, then it will get picked up. But if you are let's say 5'4" woman with a high voice, it becomes really a lot more difficult for you to be aggressive and forceful with your ideas in a meeting, which can then end up with your ideas not being taken seriously. We saw a couple examples of that in the Kotaku article. So I would just sort of underline that meritocracy has some flaws, because we're not all working from a purely objective sort of framework. Like there's a lot of subjectivity that goes into that. And when you have values that tend to favor guys, then all the women in that environment are at a disadvantage. And it's not because their ideas suck or because they're not working as hard or whatever. So the meritocracy thing will be a problem that we'll continue to come back to. And then I think the other ground rule, when we're talking about women who are coming forward with stories of harassment, there's a lot of sort of meta talk that comes out of this, like these topics about basically anytime a woman steps forward to report harassment, she's instantly being questioned about whether or not it's valid, or whether or not what actually happened, or maybe she encouraged, or maybe she interpreted wrong, or whatever. What we tend to do in supportive and advocacy groups is we believe what people say. So they're reporting a firsthand experience to say, this happened to me and it made me feel this way. Then you believe them, and then you work from there. So that's the other ground rule that I'll be working.
Sure. Sounds good, and I think that helps provide a lot of context for this. Just on the meritocracy thing, I think there will probably be some people who react and say, "Well, like, what are you suggesting we don't promote people off of meritocracy?" Because you end up in a situation where somebody could claim like, "Hey, this person has worked way harder or put way more effort in. If we are not allowed to promote people based off their merit, what is the point in trying harder? Why not reward people who are trying harder or trying to accomplish more or have found more success in their role?"
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think that we all ultimately would really love to have this pure meritocratic system where we could all say like, hey, if we put in X number of hours, then that's going to get us guarantee that we are at least recognized for the hours that we've put in, and then the quality of our work will be measured along these like predictable sort of meters. And it's not that easy. So what I would say is that companies, when they're trying to do assessments of their employees' success and the quality of their work, they just really need to be self-reflective about how they're measuring that, and where they're leaving gaps for subjective judgment, and how they can sort of temper the inequities that can come from that.
Gotcha.
I mean, I think that's why having an HR department is actually really helpful. If you have a good one, if you have a good HR department, their job is to constantly be figuring out how to judge that in a fair way. And certainly the values of the company are set by the people who are in charge and the leadership team. So they have to work really closely with their HR departments to figure out like, how can our values be represented in these sort of measurement systems, and how do we make sure that it's fair? You can't just take for granted that like, oh, well, this guy totally embodies all of our values, without recognizing like, hey, maybe he just happens to be set up for that, whereas this woman has been doing great work, but she doesn't fill that one value, whatever that is. So how can we change our sort of assessment to be able to account for that? But it is absolutely, and admittedly, it's a difficult thing, and that's why you have whole departments whose jobs are supposed to be that.
Yeah. I think you were right in suggesting that my question to start this off was a little widespread. I'll go a little bit more, on a personal level. I, for a long time, have been very aware that Riot had this strong cultural idea of we hire gamers, and usually, I think for a while at least, this might have changed recently, that was core gamers, right? Because they felt they wanted to make games that were targeted towards core gamers, like the World of Warcrafts, the Call of Duties, the League of Legends, the Dotas, the CS:GO, etc. And for me, especially until I read this article, I never really questioned that. In fact, I thought it was a great idea, right? Because if you are making a product for an audience, why not hire people who are intimately aware with that audience because they're part of it themselves? They should be best suited to make that type of game or that type of product. But it seems like perhaps there are some unfortunate side effects in following that cultural idea. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear the animal barking outside my apartment. But either way, it sounds like there's some unfortunate side effects that come along with it. I don't know if you have any thoughts on
Well,
sort of
yeah,
that
I mean,
policy.
you probably have never had your gamer credibility questioned, or at least not consistently
My
every
skill
time you talk
set,
about games.
people
Sure.
question if I'm good or not, and normally the answer is I'm bad. But nobody, you're right, that nobody ever says, well, maybe you're not really a gamer.
Yeah, like no, like maybe you're just doing it because it's popular now, which is of course a very, very silly when you start to break that down. Like, why suddenly because it's popular, so therefore, like, there are other popular things. Like, why would women suddenly flock to this just because it's become popular now?
Sure.
It's because they actually like games and have probably been playing them for a while. But I mean, women are constantly subject to gatekeeping practices where they get quizzed about, like, yeah, well, what games did you play, and how long have you been playing, and how far did you get in this and this, and what's your rank, and blah blah blah. And that was detailed in the Kotaku article as well, where women who were interviewing were talking about how it was like their credibility was being questioned at every stage, and they had to prove that they were a core gamer. But then that questioning continued. And I will say, I have personal experience coming from a professional gaming team, and still entering environments where people are disbelieving that purely because I'm a woman, that therefore I am not genuinely invested in games and don't actually love them, and probably am lying about something. I don't know, like, it's weird and can really become exhausting when you're like, no, I'm here because I love it and I
Yeah.
think that games are rad, and that you have people who are like, no, nope, you have some ulterior motive. I don't know what it is.
Well, so I filmed this Playmaker series where I interviewed and profiled a bunch of different people at Riot. I filmed it directly before all this stuff came out, which was an interesting time to release it. But I will admit that in the series, I tried to interview, I tried to ask the question to everyone I interviewed, what games have you played? What have you done? Because it's a great way oftentimes for the audience to connect. But
Sure.
in the back of my mind, while I'm interviewing the women that appeared in this series, I have no doubt that they are gamers. That's not something that I questioned, but I know that it's actually, in my mind, I've thought, oh, it's important for me to make sure that I get these questions in, because otherwise YouTube comments will flood in and say, like, well, are these people really, like, it helps add to their credibility whenever they say, like, oh, I loved playing World of Warcraft, or I loved playing this, like, RPG game or whatever.
Yeah. Well, and if you have somebody who's only been playing for a year, and then people are like, why is that? And
Yeah.
it's like, well, because maybe I only just discovered it, but that shouldn't mean that they're any less welcome or less qualified to be there. I mean, if we're talking about a game development company, you could have somebody who would be an extremely talented artist who maybe only has played World of Warcraft. Maybe they loved World of Warcraft, but that maybe is the only game that they've played. But if she happens to be a woman, that might not cut it. It might be like, well, sorry, you don't have enough experience with games. Like, if she's a talented enough artist and she's got the style that you want, you would hope that would qualify them. I mean, again, there's a lot of subjective stuff that goes into hiring. Hiring is a really complex thing, but that idea of hiring gamers is fraught because there is sort of baked into that idea of what a gamer is stereotypically, women are at a disadvantage.
So do you think it would be wise for Riot to change their policy away from saying we only hire gamers? Should they start to hire people who don't necessarily have a gaming background?
I mean, I feel like that's probably so central to who Riot is. I can't imagine them doing that. I can't foresee them making a huge change to their values that way. But I would say that perhaps refining what they mean by that it would be the most sort of helpful step, and being aware of how this idea of the core gamer can discriminate. I mean, the other thing, they're trying to make another game, right? Like, they can't
Multiple
live
games.
with, right? So they need to diversify their portfolio anyway. I think that they would actually benefit from maybe casting a wider net and being open to looking at people with a more diverse background. I mean, certainly, like, you want people to, in gaming is a passion industry. You want people to love the product that they're working on. And I mean, to be real, people get paid less in the game industry. So for the most part, if people are applying for game industry jobs instead of just going straight to Silicon Valley tech, it's because they like games. Like, they're here because they're passionate about it.
Yeah.
But that I think is probably central to the Riot culture, to the point where even if somebody didn't love games and didn't love the games that Riot was making, they probably wouldn't have a great experience at the company anyway. Like, they probably just wouldn't think it was so great. So that part, I wouldn't say they have to change that necessarily, but thinking of ways to cast a wider net would not only be beneficial for the company, but beneficial for the people potentially being hired.
Yeah. How, what do you think of just the idea of how widespread all these issues are within the company, because I struggled with this. Not that I didn't believe it. In fact, it was very believable to me and struck me as I was thinking about how their culture is and sort of the cultural values, how those values could sort of occur. But for me, a lot of the stuff, as somebody who's followed it for a long time, I was surprised because I've met women there who seem to get promoted, seem to not face these issues in conversations with them, and certainly we saw people come out on Twitter say that they hadn't had these issues before. Then we saw a whole lot of other people who had, and so I think for the audience, for myself, but also just for like the general audience on Reddit or Twitter or elsewhere, it's like, wait, so is Riot just filled with all these sexist people? Does it suck to be a woman there? Or is this something smaller? In which case, do you consider it less important because it's like isolated certain areas of the company that can be cleaned up? I think a lot of people have had a hard time sort of figuring out how to tackle that idea.
Sure. So, I mean, Riot is a very large company. And so I think that acknowledging that people can have very different experiences dependent upon which department they're in. Because I have a friend who's a woman who works at Riot and has said that she has not personally had these experiences. However, she has witnessed a lot of these sort of toxic cultural behaviors, and she says that she's in a great group and she feels like she's pretty lucky, and that's part of the reason why she hasn't had negative experiences. But I mean, I think that the way to relate to this is like, look, all of us, men and women, have had an experience with a bully at some point, probably, or somebody who is a jerk to you, and it can be isolated and isolating, and it's very possible that your best friend never had that toxic experience with that person. So, like, I think that the worst experiences are usually exacerbated by an individual. But the cultural problems at Riot that are more pervasive are that they encourage certain bad behaviors that can then lead to sort of these patterns that can become really toxic when sort of taken up by the wrong person, if that makes sense. Sure. Like if you have individuals that concentrate, the one who's farting on people, like that's one person, right? But like he's able to do that because there is a culture at Riot of dominance, this sort of toxic masculinity, dominance and aggressive behavior, where it's like if you balk at my farting on your face, then you're a wimp, and therefore I have just dominated you and I've won, and your opinions are therefore lesser. And that impacts both men and women in the culture. But the company itself is not encouraging people to fart on people, but the company is enabling that behavior by allowing sort of this free reign of aggression, and not letting people, not kind of telling people like, hey, we all have different communication styles, and maybe you like talking over people is actually not okay. Like we need to give an opportunity for other people to talk and to listen, for example. Like we can take the gender aspect out of that and make it more relatable to people. But however, I will again come back to the fact that women, when we're talking about some of these negative patterns, women are 10 times more likely to encounter them and to be sort of shut down and have their ideas dismissed by them when you have these sort of toxic masculinity sort of practices that come out. And by the way, I do want to clarify, because toxic masculinity is a phrase that I know gets really lots of people riled up, and it's mostly because they don't understand what we're referring to. I actually had this discussion with my dad because he got really defensive about it. Toxic masculinity does not mean that masculinity in itself is toxic. It means that there is a certain brand of masculinity that sort of extracts certain things that you might associate with masculinity, like dominance and aggression, and takes those and makes those aspects toxic and abusive. So I don't want to be on the record as saying that masculinity itself is toxic, because it's not. But this is a certain brand of masculinity that sometimes, like you sometimes see it in traditional sports environments, where you hear about like bullies on NFL teams who like basically beat down any of the rookies and do horrible things to them until those rookies have to finally stand up for themselves. Like that's the type of thing that we're talking about. And I think that Riot has some some patterns of behavior that tend to emerge because of their values of like speaking up and being transparent. And if you have a problem with some decision that somebody made, then you go directly to them and you talk to them about it and you confront them. Which, you know, on paper that sounds like, wow, that'd be a really healthy communication environment. But when you actually unpack it, it starts to become problematic.
Yeah.
Which again, that's where I go to, like, when you reflect on how that could be problematic for some people, that's where you can start to make change that it will be beneficial for a more diverse workforce.
Speaking of that sort of reflection on individuals and sort of like the systemic issues that occur, there was a account that came out recently by a former rioter, a man who had an interaction with Mark and Brandon, the co-founders of the company, no longer leading the day-to-day of the company, but or I guess this was maybe, I think in 2013 was the account. Brandon,
2014, I think.
2014?
Yeah.
Brandon had made a hiring summit on hiring a rape joke about how no doesn't mean no. And that joke was then sort of put into a document, and that there's a conversation that occurred between this male Riot employee and some folks on his team. He went and brought these issues to Mark and Brandon, and there was almost kind of, at least from his description, an attempt to reorganize his thoughts on it, or explain why this is acceptable, or why these types of jokes need to exist within Riot culture, because otherwise Riot loses its identity in some sense. What was your personal opinion on all that stuff as you were reading through that?
So again, not surprised. Although it was really interesting to kind of see him talk about a very specific instance of what it could look like inside Riot or a similar game development company when somebody steps forward and speaks out about the behavior of leadership and questions leadership, and sort of what transpired after that, and how he sort of stood up for what he believed in. He gave Brandon the opportunity to either apologize or take it back, or even just be reflective and be like, oh, hey, I hadn't thought of it that way. But as you just described it, it led to a meeting with a bunch of other people where they kind of tried to talk him out of his stance, and then he stood by his values. And then it seemed like he said that he could tell, it became awkward. He could tell that he was being sort of put on probation because he was not, they were starting to doubt that he was truly invested in the success of the company and the values of the company or whatever. And so it really sounded like he took a huge hit for standing up and speaking out, which is actually a really bad sign at a company. If you can't give feedback to leadership when you think that something is wrong, and your job is suddenly jeopardized because you step forward, like that is the sign that something is not going well, and that he actually pointed out also the fact that he was the only person who had brought up how a rape joke during a hiring conference on a stage to hundreds of people. If nobody else had brought up that was a problem or chimed in, like that's a real sign that there are people who are afraid to speak up because they're afraid that their jobs will be put on the line. So that's what stood out to me is how bad that can be. Like, you really need to be able to have a process for being able to give feedback, but also how it seems like a sort of warping of the values that Riot does profess to find important. Like they really do encourage their employees to confront each other if they disagree. Like, and that's something that many of the rioters I know actually really appreciate that part of the culture. This seems like that was not the case in this situation, and I don't know if that's because I don't know. I wasn't there, and I wasn't hearing all the rationalizations that were coming out, but I do find that to be kind of alarming. Although again, that was in 2014, and I know that there's been a leadership change. So hopefully, the new leadership, and maybe this is that kind of pattern, helped to contribute to the leadership change for the day-to-day stuff. But as they say, the fish rots from the head. So leadership and that management team at the very top really has to own the changes that need to happen, and own that reevaluation of like, what do our values mean, what should they be, and how is that going to impact the work experience of the people here. And I think, you know, Riot has stepped forward and made statements about the changes that they're going to make and how they're going to reflect. So
Yeah, I do want to ask you about that in a little bit, because I'm super interested to sort of see what your take is.
Let's do it now.
Well, the one quick question I did want to ask you before we move on is just with this Mark and Brandon story. You know, I was speaking to a friend of mine who said that as horrified as he was by the initial Kotaku article, that one struck home to him because it was so specific, and that the Kotaku article often said, you know, this female writer experienced this from a male writer, but knowing, you know, Mark and Brandon being at the top, being such, you know, they're lauded in a lot of ways as visionaries within the industry, and I think within Riot there was just a ton of faith in these individuals. You know, like, what is your take on them after this point? Because do you think a lot of people should lose faith in them as leaders? Do you think that, you know, it is good that they stepped down? I mean, I think a lot of people are wondering how should they view these two people after this account.
I mean, that's really tricky because, you know, they have represented a lot that is good. If you're a gamer and you love League of Legends, like, they have helped make that a wonderful experience for you. And, you know, they have stayed very true to the idea of making a game for gamers, that they're making it for the community, and they care about what the community thinks. I mean, as a former community manager, that speaks to me. Like, I understand that passion, and I understand why people believe that that's important. I do not, however, think that they should be in the position where they are dictating the changes that need to happen with the culture. Like, they can be touchstones, maybe cultural touchstones for what the culture has been, and the things that are good, that they ultimately, as a team, as the whole leadership team, decides like what core values you know, really will keep Riot. And we decide what those things are. They can be part of that team and should be part of that team. But like, by no means should the new chief diversity and inclusion officer be reporting to them, for example, like, which I don't think is the case. I think they're saying that it's going to be reporting to the new CEO.
Yeah, Nicolo, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, and having some distance there is good. You need to have some separation, where, you know, somebody else is the one who's making the ultimate calls. But, you know, I also think people can grow and people can change, but they need to go through this process where the stuff is being exposed. You
Sure.
know, like, I think probably it would have been a lot easier for Brandon if he had just, in the moment, you know, at the time when he got that email, if he'd been like, oh shit, like, I didn't realize people read it that way, and I'm sorry that I caused those feelings, like, that was not my intention, then he wouldn't be dealing with this right now. Like, that is the thing he probably should have acknowledged. Like, yeah, you're right, rape jokes from the leadership to, you know, in a professional environment is wildly inappropriate. We can probably agree with that. Like, we don't have to debate rape jokes otherwise. Like, it's really just like, in a professional setting, you don't need to be making rape jokes.
Sure.
I think that's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, I mean, that seems I think few people would debate that.
Right. Like, we can pretty much agree with that. And so that's why that was the part that concerned me, is because he was not open to that feedback. So, you know, as far as people having their personal heroes sort of brought down a few notches, like, that's hard. And maybe there needs to be some time of reckoning and some time of growth. And maybe they will have the opportunity to earn that sort of love and adoration back. And hopefully they will do the right thing. And support Riot and their current employees the right way to sort of show that they deserve that adoration in the future.
One of the individuals that was referenced in the article is a woman named Soha El Sabawi. I might be ruining her last name, much like I ruined yours. But
Soha.
yeah,
Yeah,
we'll go
Soha
with
is
Soha.
I think she's the diversity and inclusion manager,
Yeah,
who was hired, 18 months ago?
yeah,
A year and a
something
half
around
ago?
that time.
Yeah.
The article pressed on her a little bit in statements, just sort of pointing out that it seemingly there was no change in the diversity ratio at Riot, if that's what you would call it, the 80-20, I think is what they have right now with male to female. What is your general take there? Because that was an interesting moment to me in the article, in that it was the first time that there had been, or at least to my knowledge or memory, a discussion around existing diversity initiatives within the company or attempts to change, and it certainly left, I think, a lot of people walking away from that feeling as though there wasn't much change happening, or that up until maybe this moment there hadn't been much change that had occurred within Riot.
Yeah. Well, so first I'll say that the kind of culture change that we're talking about takes a long time. And it especially takes a long time if you are having to have these conversations with the people who are in the leadership positions. I suspect that Soha has spent much of the past 18 months having these difficult conversations and trying to explain why some stuff is not acceptable and not okay, and why where the opportunities for improvement are, and like she's gonna have those conversations, and that's a hard job and it takes a lot of time. So I mean, I would say we don't get to see all of that, and I think it's fair actually for people to have a chance to work through those conversations behind closed doors and not be judged for them all the time. Like, you want to give people space to kind of figure out things, especially things that are difficult, and especially if they're having to kind of make a 180 on what they maybe previously believed. So I think that there's a lot of work that's been going on behind the scenes. The other thing I would note, that if we're talking specifically about the sort of gender proportion, or and whether or not that is improved, when we're talking about diversity and inclusion, so first, just to clarify, those are really two equally important parts of the equation when we're talking about, like, we ultimately would like to see equity. Gender equity, then diversity and inclusion are equally important. Diversity refers to hiring people with a bunch of different backgrounds and perspectives. The inclusion part, however, means once they're there, you actually have to proactively find ways to make sure that the culture is accepting and welcoming and inclusive for them, because just hiring them doesn't do it. Like, that's not going to help. Like, what ends up happening if you just hire a few women and then throw them into a cultural environment that punishes women for speaking out, and punishes them for staying quiet, and punishes them for not being the cool girl who can tolerate rape jokes. Like, if you put women in that environment, it's basically meat for the grinder. You need to figure out ways to assess your culture to make it more aware and more inclusive. So, and I actually think we should probably call it inclusion and diversity in that order, because you need to fix some of the inclusion problems first before you start feeding a bunch of diversity into your workforce. Right. That makes sense. So, I mean, I can only speculate, but I would say that in the ideal situation, those difficult conversations are happening. I think they're trying to figure out, like, what Riot should look like in the future, what that can what that can mean in the day-to-day experience in the studio, and they're trying to do that first before really aggressively going after a sort of diverse hiring strategy. And again, that's total speculation, but I would say that there's a lot that we're not able to see, and that's probably giving a company space to figure that stuff out is fine. And they should take that time necessary to do that.
Sure. And before we get to those statements that Riot has made, sort of following all this, I do want to tackle just the second or aftershock controversy, or whatever you want to call it, that sprung up this past weekend, where we saw a event at PAX West that was made exclusively towards women or non-binary during a certain time frame of the day, after which I think it was like 2:30, men were allowed to attend. So this created a huge eruption over the course of the weekend, not just because of that, but also because of some very strong statements that individuals at Riot made about the initial reaction to this, right? Frustration that
Mhm.
the community felt like this was unfair, and there were some strong words and different ways to describe the community that were made in light of all this stuff, and that I think further entrenched people and deepened the issue. Um, so first off, is it for me? I will say I was not surprised that the community reacted the way they did when they heard about this news. We were talking about it a little bit before this interview, because I think for a lot of the individuals who heard these stories from Riot, their their take was, okay, we should have equality then, right? Like men and women should not be treated differently. It's terrible that women were treated differently. No one should be treated differently. And for them, they felt, all right, well, this now you've just reversed the issue. Now men are not allowed into this event. That's unfair to people who might be allies of the case or whatever. For them, that they found that very offensive. So I don't know if you have a sort of thought on that.
Yeah, I mean, so I have a lot of experience with this particular type of backlash because I have been on an all women's team and I have participated in organizing all women's CS:GO leagues, and this is the backlash that happens all the time, and I will say that I certainly applaud the notion that equality is best. Like I agree with that, and I think we all probably can agree. Like let's get to that point. That is where we are trying to go in the future. And like if we're talking about esports competitions, for example, ultimately we would love to see women on those final stages and see men and women playing together and seeing equity in that environment and in that culture, and in the game development environment, where actually I think that they're doing better than the elite tiers of esports. We would love to see a lot more women participating in game development and feeling welcome in game development. I think we can agree that. Getting there, however, is difficult, and it is not something that we cannot get there just by passively waiting for it to happen. I was speaking from experience. Like when I was with the Fragdoll team, we started in 2004, and it felt like for a while there was progress being made, but then it also felt like we backslid in the last sort of 5 years in terms of visibility of women in gaming and esports. So you need to take proactive measures to be able to support the women who are currently in the space, and then also find ways to invite more women in. And one of the ways to do that is to create new all women's spaces. And I think it's important to identify that we're not suggesting that we create whole companies that are all women, or like a whole like alternative universe of that is only women. We're adding to the existing ecosystem. So like those people who feel like, oh god, they're taking something away from me, like they're taking this space away, they're taking away access to Riot by making this panel room women only or whatever. Like we're trying to add to the experiences that are available, not trying to take anything away from anybody. And that's also the way it works with the all women's tournaments. Like we create alternative women's tournaments. We're not trying to match the main event, because ultimately we want women to be playing in the main event tournaments, but providing them a space to play with our all women's teams helps them to sort of rise to the top as role models. We get better visibility because we're like, oh yeah, all these women are playing over here, and look, some of them are really, really good, which is harder to find those people. And have them feel supported when you're talking about like the main event tournaments. I mean, we can look at Gaguri in the Overwatch League, for example. Like she thankfully is super well supported, but it is really brutal to get to the point where you're the only woman in a league. Like it's a much more supportive environment to get that experience first, playing with a bunch of women before you step foot into the pressure cooker that is the main event tournaments. So all that to say that there are opportunities and places where having some all women spaces can be really beneficial for the women who are there. They can share stories that they might not feel comfortable sharing in front of guys. They can meet each other and network and find other women who are having the similar experiences. And it can be very bolstering and encouraging for them to know that they're not alone, that they're not the only ones who have had these experiences. and also to find other women who maybe have great experiences at their company or within Riot or whatever, and be able to talk to them and be like, hey, here, this part of working at this company kind of sucks, but here's all the stuff that's awesome. So let me give you a more sort of nuanced story about my personal experience. And being able to do that in a women's only environment is a lot easier.
Do you think that there were alternative paths for that event? For instance, having like the main room open the entire time to everybody, but then having a separate session in a different room where women. That I think was a lot of people's reaction was, well, I want to go before 2:30. It sucks that I can't go because of my gender. It seems like there's an opportunity there to have had that room available during that time to everybody, and then create a separate space or something for this type of thing. There would have been less.
Well, I think Riot's trying to, make a statement, right, and try to sort of make up for some of the negative stuff that has happened in the past, and they don't want it to seem like their effort to support women is on the sideline. So I think that making their main space dedicated to women was a statement to the women in the space that, like, hey, you're important and we want you to be here, and we're going to dedicate this space to you. But like, ultimately, I think in the future, I don't know that they will feel that they need to do this the same way, and may find other ways to. I mean, they will absolutely find other ways to support women, but they probably will continue to do some women only stuff. And it really, but I mean, the goal here is supporting the women. So I think the question is, were the women happy about it?
Sure.
Did they feel like it was beneficial for them? And that's really what matters. Like, I'm sorry that some people had their feelings hurt. It sucks to feel excluded. Like, it does. It really does. We all can say that's the case, and all of the women in the game industry have experience with that feeling. So coming from a place of compassion and empathy, I know that can be shocking, and it can feel like you're having something taken away. But hopefully, once the initial sting of that fades a little bit, people will find the generosity to be like, hey, if this is a special and beneficial thing for them, and like they honestly said it was good for them, then sure, maybe it's worth doing, and we can find something else to do until 2:30.
Sure. One of the things that I saw folks bringing up, and I want to ask you this just so that there's a chance to address it. A lot of people said, "Hey, I consider myself an ally. I want this stuff to be supported. Now I find myself frustrated because of the way that this was taken." Right. So, in a sense, I see what you mean when you say that it matters how the women feel about it. But is there any concern that there are people who would normally be in support of initiatives like this, or people who find themselves, like they generally don't care? Now they're frustrated. You perhaps create a group of frustrated people who now are aligned opposite of you rather than somewhere in the middle or even on your side.
I mean, I'm not really sure that there are too many allies and self-identified allies out there who are genuinely frustrated by this. Like, you might be disappointed at first, right? But like, if we refocus what is important here, which is that we're trying to support the women who are currently in the industry or thinking about getting into the industry. We're supporting those women and trying to find ways to support them and encourage them. That's what's important. I think that, and most allies, if that's refocused for them, then they will be like, okay, fine. That sounds like that would be a helpful thing. I can't imagine that frustration will genuinely linger, and I would caution people too to not get too distracted by the sort of meta anger. There's like a lot of meta chatter around this stuff, which distracts from the actual issue. Like, when we're getting mad about some of the sort of backtalk that was seen on Twitter from frustrated Riot employees, where they're frustrated with the backlash that they're seeing, and so then they come out and then they call people idiots. I don't remember exactly what the terminology was, but they sort of lash out, and we have people lashing out at each other. That's a distraction. Like, on all sides, it's a distraction from the actual purpose and the actual point of all of this. And so if you're an ally and you want to actually see this equality ultimately, then listening to the women and what they actually say is helpful, is kind of the first step. And then asking how to be involved. And maybe that's the next step that Riot should take, is maybe thinking about like how can we actively sort of involve the guys in our community who want to be part of the solution. Like, how do you do that? And there are ally programs out there in other parts of social advocacy and in certain parts of game development where like ally training is a thing, and ally awareness, and being aware of like what if you witness a woman being harassed or being subject to some like gross language or whatever, like what should you do? Because that's not just hard for the woman who's suffering from it, it's awkward for everybody who's witnessing it, and people frequently don't know what to do. They're like, I don't know, should I like confront that guy, or should I like what do I do? And so giving people the tools inside the company to know how to handle that would be really helpful. And I think helping the community to be aware of those problems and it would also be really helpful.
The last question on this PAX thing, you kind of referenced it with the back talk. I know you said not to be distracted by it, but it's hard not to bring it up given the fact that it went on to then just dominate so much of the conversation. There was a very kind of aggressive reaction from some of the Riot folks or people who were in support of this on Twitter. Not everybody, but some. And I think a lot of people, one of the higher up comments I saw in one of the Reddit threads got a lot of upvotes was, I was in support of this initiative and still am, but I don't appreciate that, individuals are casting, one of them as a system designers at Riot Games was calling people man beasts. It's sort of that idea that instead of having the conversation...
Was it man babies?
Man babies, yes. Maybe that was it, sorry. Man babies. Sorry. This sense of like, hey, instead of having the conversation about this, you just sort of blanket everyone the same way, or you disregard anybody who could see a separate angle to this.
Well, I mean, so for that person, if he was in support of this, then he wasn't the target of that comment.
Sure.
That I don't think he was the man baby in question. But let's put on our empathy hats here, and let's try to imagine the pressure that the rioters have been under for the last several weeks since the Kotaku thing came out and since subsequent articles have come out. They're under the microscope, and I'm sure people are asking them constantly about their experiences and what Riot's going to do, and so they feel under a lot of pressure. And on top of that, anytime that Riot comes out and says like, okay, we're going to take these steps, there's a huge backlash where people are like, Riot's not doing enough, or the fact that Riot is doing this is stupid. And so they're under assault. And have been under assault for the last few weeks. So if we're wearing our empathy hats and trying to empathize, like, they're dealing with a lot of pressure. And I think in particular, that one systems designer in question, I think is somebody who has talked about these sort of toxic cultural patterns before and experienced them and has seen them firsthand and has been frustrated by them. And so, I think that he reached boiling point. Which, blowing up on Twitter rarely is a thing that makes anybody feel good at the end of the day. Like, it can cause more problems than it's worth, but I can't say that I blame that reaction. But that's the reason why I call it a distraction, is because that person is reacting out of frustration, and then everybody else is reacting out of frustration, and now we're biting each other because we're all frustrated about each other's tone. None of that matters. Like, if we're stepping back, we should step back a second, say none of that actually matters. What actually matters is how are we going to solve this problem, and what are we going to do? Like, what solutions are we going to try? And you know what? Sometimes I think, and this is actually a thing that we do with AnyKey, is we try to sort of frame all of the initiatives that we try as experiments, because this problem has not been solved yet. So nobody knows what the golden solution is going to be, or if it's going to be a special cocktail of initiatives and research and whatever and awareness campaigns. Like, we don't know yet. We're trying things out to see what helps. So in this case, Riot tried something. I hope that the women who attended benefited and felt supported and got something positive out of it. And then hopefully, the Riot team that organized it will learn something and make something even better next time. And that is ultimately what is, I think, worth spending energy on, rather than the frustration that gets spouted on both sides.
So I know you're running low on time. I've taken you for quite some time, but I want to just sort of at the end put an end cap on this. So Riot came out with their statement. I've seen and heard from friends and people online sort of mixed reactions to it. People who really thought it was great, others who thought it was okay, but maybe lacked some teeth. What was your reaction to their statement?
Um, the thing that I always get sort of caught up in myself is imagining how these conversations are unfolding behind closed doors. Um, and I feel like the statements that Riot has made so far really sort of, like, if you're aware of the tensions that they're trying to balance, it sort of becomes obvious how many parties they're trying to involve in a very complex process. So, and on top of that, like, I also was listening to a lot of the responses and heard dissatisfaction of all kinds. I would say that it's progress. I hope to see that actually manifest in big ways. But again, I know that this culture change takes a long time. And it has to come from the leadership. So what I think would maybe be helpful is if some of the leaders personally took this on and took responsibility for this change. Because so far it seems like we've seen a lot of like big statements from Riot as a company, which sort of depersonalizes it. And on one hand, it makes it so that all the rioters can own it as part of their own sort of project and as their own goal. But it would be nice, I think, to be able to actually sort of associate some of the leaders within Riot with this mission. And hey, maybe that's the chief diversity and inclusion officer that they're going to eventually hire. But I think it remains to be seen how effective and dramatic this change is going to be.
And then the last question here is just, if they're on the outside, after all this stuff has hit, I've seen a lot of people who, in the community, who say, for years now I've wanted to work at Riot, and I just don't want to anymore. Like, that dream is gone for me. Or people who say, like, I don't know if I want to keep playing this game or supporting this or following the esport or anything. Do you have any thoughts for those people who might be looking at their future in association with the company, with the game, and sort of the community, and unsure of which direction to head?
So for those who sort of dreamed of working for Riot, I think it depends on what kind of person you are, and what you can tolerate. Because I think that this is going to be a really intense next year probably for Riot. I know that as they're trying to develop new IPs, like, that already is sort of a tumultuous process, and now they're having to undergo a culture change. So it's going to be kind of a wild, chaotic place for the next year, maybe even two. I don't know. Like, it's hard to say how long pieces will be falling into place. If you're the type of person who is really gung-ho and wants to go in there and sort of make your own future and influence what the company turns into, then maybe this is a great opportunity to be applying to Riot. But if you're somebody who has already dealt with work environments where you've had to experience this kind of baloney, like, and sort of negative situations, I think that it would probably bring back memories that were not productive. Sometimes people come out of these sort of environments with PTSD, like, for real, and I don't think that this is probably the best environment for you. But again, a lot of the stories that are coming out are a year to 4 years old. Some of the women that I've talked to who are currently there are very determined and very optimistic about the future of Riot, which gives me hope. If they have hope and they're there every day, then I have hope too. But again, I that's where I look to the leadership. If the leadership is bought in, then I think that the change that we're hoping to see will actually have a chance of happening. But if we're not seeing the leadership actually own it, and it's kind of relegated to like, oh, our diversity and inclusion team is going to do all this stuff for us, then that is a little bit more concerning. So, that's where we all kind of have to wait and see. And if you're a fan of the game, I mean, shoot, if you're a fan of the game, you're a fan of the game. And I can't blame anybody if they want to take a break from it for a while, if it like leaves a bad taste in their mouth. Like that, I'm not going to try to sugarcoat that for anybody. But I suspect that there are a lot of people who will continue to play anyway and just hope that Riot gets better.
Yeah, very good. Is there anything that you would say to anybody there? Any resources or anything that you would like to speak on? Just kind of an open floor here for you at the end.
Sure. Well, so AnyKey is the organization that I work for, and you can find us on Twitter at AnyKey.org, and we do research and we do initiatives, and we are always happy to consider research angles. Like if people have questions that they would like answered, or they're curious about certain aspects of gaming culture, both in communities, player communities, and also game industry. Like we're doing new research projects all the time, so we're always happy to get ideas there. And that's always, a good place to engage us about these kinds of topics. And if you have questions about like basic stuff, like I keep seeing this term cis be tossed around and I have no idea what it means. Like, can you give me context? You can tweet us at AnyKey.org.
Very good. Well, hey, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. Hopefully there's a lot of people who found value in our conversation, and maybe they'll follow up with you at AnyKey.org on Twitter.
Yep.
Thank you so much.
Travis.